January 2015 marks the 50th anniversary of the death of Winston Churchill. In this programme, we're going to be looking at the relationship Churchill had with the Islamic world and the Arab world. And to find out more about that, we've come here to Cambridge, to Churchill College, to talk to two academics who've written extensively about the relationship between the Arab world, the Islamic world, and Winston Churchill. During his long life, Churchill was personally well acquainted with the Muslim and Arab world.
The interesting thing was that there were lots of things he didn't know. I mean, one of the things that you read about in his papers here at Churchill College is he didn't know the difference between a Sunni and a Shia. So although he was fully aware of the Middle East and, of course, and had served, the northwest frontier and all the rest, he relied very much on his advisors. And of course, his advisors therefore were able to sort of call the tune in a way that wouldn't otherwise have been the case. So he had to rely on Gertrude Bell, and T. Lawrence and people like that.
You've recently been in the news concerning a letter which you uncovered written in 1907 by Churchill's sister-in-law warning him against converting to Islam. I mean, Churchill was the epitome of the British Empire. I mean, was there a serious consideration of conversion to Islam?
Well, I wouldn't say that Churchill was personally seriously considering converting to Islam, but he was at the time spending a lot of time with Wilfrid Blunt and with various Arabists, and he had served obviously on the northwest frontier, and he had served in Sudan, and undoubtedly his sister-in-law at the time sort of knew that, and he was just about to depart for a sort of colonial tour of Africa, and so she sort of perhaps was worrying for his fate. Now I don't think that means that he was ever actually considering converting to Islam, but it does sort of demonstrate, I think, that he did have a sort of general fascination with Islam in the East and sort of, Islamic culture.
I mean, you mentioned Wilfrid Blunt. I mean, he was a pan-Arabist. He supported the creation of a sort of pan-Arab state in the Middle East. He was a critic of the British Empire. He formed a friendship with Churchill. I mean, Churchill, again, the epitome of empire. Again, it seems an unlikely coming together.
Very much so. They were absolutely unlikely friends. Perhaps they became friends because Wilfrid Blunt had been Lord Randolph Churchill's friend.
His father. Exactly,
yes. And when Churchill was writing the biography of his father, Blunt helped him and provided him material regarding his father. And they often became friends, and they would often actually dress up as Arabs and wander around in sort of Bedouin Arab outfits and would wander around Blunt's estate. And it's one of those very interesting things that only crops up here and there, but it's in the Blunt papers. You can see it. And they became friends. They very rarely agreed on policy, and that's very clear because Churchill, as you say, was an imperialist, though quite a liberal or progressive Victorian imperialist, you might say. Where Blunt was an anti-imperial. I mean, in literary terms, you might call him the anti-Kipling, because he was so critical of the British Empire. But it is interesting that Churchill, I mean, it just again demonstrates how sort of open-minded Churchill was, that he had friends that were so anti-imperial and they could sit down and discuss matters of empire and matters of the Orient or the Levant and disagree, but also still be friends at the end of the day.
In his book, The River War, published in 1899, which is Churchill's account of his participation in the British reconquest of Sudan, Churchill writes, "How dreadful are the curses which Mohammedanism weighs on its votaries, improvement habits, slovenly systems of agriculture, sluggish methods of commerce. The influence of the religion paralyzes the social development of those who follow it." I mean, this was a quote which was much quoted back in 2003 by supporters of the American-led invasion of Iraq, kind of an Islamophobic agenda. I mean, how does that suggest that Churchill was unsympathetic to Islam?
Well, no. In fact, I would make the argument that quote has been heavily taken out of context because it was popularized in the sort of run-up to the sort of invasion of Iraq and things, and was sort of used for political purposes. So it's a
kind of war of civilizations.
Exactly, and it's become a heavily politicized quote. When in fact, there are various parts that get edited out that talk about how Muslims have become brave and loyal subjects of the Queen, and he talks in numbers, and he uses the term thousands. And this indicates that Churchill's referring specifically to the dervish population that he's been fighting against. Because again, he had been stationed previously on the northwest frontier and had served with Muslims and had served with Sikhs and sort of several different sort of cultures on the northwest frontier. And as a result, you can see that he would have known there were millions of Muslims in the service of the Queen if you're talking about all of sort of Islam. So he's very clearly, in my opinion, referring specifically to the sort of dervish kind of fanatic type of Islam. Furthermore, it's interesting that edition of the River War was actually edited, and that was cut out of it the next year, and was taken down from 2 volumes to 1 volume. So I think using that quote to try to say this is Churchill's view of all Islam is sort of radically misleading.
Before the First World War, Churchill was regarded as something of a champion of the Ottoman Empire, and indeed, you suggest he was prepared to go and fight for the Ottoman Empire in a war in the 1890s against Greece.
Yes, that's right. In the Greco-Turkish War of 1897, Churchill was writing to his mother, and at first he couldn't decide whether or not he should fight with the Greeks or with the Ottomans, and he ultimately comes down on the side of the Ottoman Empire, that he will fight for them, and he even has his mother, or prepares his mother to send money to the bank, but by the time he reaches where he was on a boat when the war broke out, and by the time he reaches the port, the war had already ended and the Ottomans had already won. So it is very interesting. And then moving forward, he was definitely supported the idea of a sort of an alliance between the Ottoman Empire and Great Britain prior to the First World War. And in fact, it took a holiday to the Eastern Mediterranean where he visited leaders of the Ottoman Empire and Talat Bey Pasha, Enver Bey Pasha, Yavuz Bey Pasha, and others, and was on a tour of Constantinople and so forth prior to the First World War. And you can see in the documents just before the war, he writes that he exchanges a correspondence at first in 1911 with Yavuz Bey Pasha about the possibility of an alliance between the British Empire and the Ottoman Empire during the sort of Libyan war that was going on at the time. And then again, just prior to the First World War, Churchill again tries to say, please remain neutral to the Ottoman Empire, despite the fact that at the Admiralty he did sequester 2 Ottoman battleships, which of course precipitated the Ottomans pulling away from Britain. Although historically that's quite complicated.
Well, it was a big prize, and he thought, being Easterner, he thought that you could end the war earlier because he didn't think you could win the war on the Western Front. So if you had, and of course he was to have this in the Second World War with the soft underbelly of Italy approach, and basically the Gallipoli was the soft underbelly equivalent of the First World War. So if you knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and then you help knock Bulgaria out of the war, then you can then go on to then hit Germany from underneath and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and get them the other way round. And also, of course, the other key thing was Russia was still a major player in the war till 1917, and the Russians were very keen for us to get Turkey out of the war, so then they could concentrate on the war against Germany, and they wouldn't have to concentrate on the war against the Ottoman Turks.
As Colonial Secretary, Churchill was responsible at the end of the First World War for the creation of Iraq.
I think it was a huge mistake. Ideally, it should have been originally it was 3 Ottoman Empire vilayets. There was the Basra one in the south, the Mosul one in the north, and the Baghdad one in the middle. And the northern one, of course, was Kurdish. The middle one was Sunni Muslim, and the southern one was Shia Muslim. And and the Shia Muslim one looked south to trade and to the British Empire and all the rest of the. And then the northern one was Kurdish and really had nothing to do with anything else. And then the middle one should have been really part of Syria. And the northern one, interesting enough, would have been part of Syria had Lloyd George not done a deal with Clemenceau, and because Lloyd George had heard that there was possibly oil in the northern part of Iraq, what we now call Iraq, and said that he told Clemenceau, I want Mosul, and Clemenceau said, yes, but we'll only do that if we get what we want in Syria. And so consequently the British weren't able to help Faisal in Syria, but they were able to get Mosul instead, and so made Faisal king of the new Iraq instead, with these 3 vilayets put together that were completely artificial.
And after the First World War, he became Colonial Secretary as well as War Minister, and he was responsible with T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, for drawing up the boundaries of much of today's Middle East. I mean, again, did his concern with Islam come into that at all?
Well, yes. I mean, the first thing that I would say that you could say, or the most obvious thing, is that Churchill was trying to do right by all of the sort of British subjects and all of the sort of Islamic tribesmen that he could, which is why he brings in experts like T.E. Lawrence and Gertrude Bell, all of whom were also friends or disciples in some way of Wilfrid Blunt. And he actually listens to what they have to say. And Percy Cox from Iraq, and he actually considers what they're saying, and he tries to create boundary lines based on what he's been told at the time. Now, of course, as we know, we've seen a case where it's been incredibly successful in the case of Jordan, and we've seen a case where it's been incredibly unsuccessful, which is Iraq, which is still sort of a mess. But it's very interesting that he took the time to listen to what they had to say, and that he tried to do his best. But he had been given an impossible task to sort of square the fact that Britain had made 3 conflicting pledges, which was completely out of his. He wasn't responsible for these pledges.
And the 3 pledges were?
So there was the pledge in the McMahon Hussein correspondence, which sort of promised an Arab state or Arab states. There was the promise to France in the Sykes-Picot arrangement so that France would have a sort of sphere of influence and Britain would have a sphere of influence. And then there's, of course, the Balfour Declaration, which promised not a national, but a homeland for the Jews in Palestine.
Many of today's problems in both Syria and Iraq flow from that decision, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. Well, the funny thing is, of course, it's even ancient news. Because I remember meeting some American soldier, steeped in Baptist Sunday school tradition, and he woke up and suddenly thought, I'm in Nineveh. I read about this at Sunday school when I was 12, And so, yes, this is the interesting thing. All these ancient Mesopotamian places, the cradle of civilization, it's all in present-day Iraq. So a lot of people knew a lot about it, but they knew about it in the wrong context. So Lloyd George, for example, also knew about the Middle East, but he said he knew about his knowledge was Sunday school. So he didn't know about it in terms of who lives there now, and Churchill didn't really understand who lives there now either. And so he was very able to be pushed around by people like T. Lawrence, who felt they owed it to the Hashemite dynasty to give Faisal a crown in the way that they hadn't been able to give him a crown in Syria.
Did Churchill grasp the importance of Middle Eastern oil?
He was looking at the terms of oil, and he was also looking in terms of the safe route to India as well. And of course, he was also looking at the point of view of wanting to save money, because one of his big ambitions was to be Chancellor of the Exchequer. And so he thought if he saved the British money, then, of course, he would look good, and then he'd be the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And then, unfortunately, the job was given to somebody else, a man called Sir Robert Horne, who nobody's ever heard of since, But he wanted to do that, and so he was Secretary of State for War before he was Secretary of State for the Colonies. And Lord Curzon called him, he was a sort of imperial, he was Secretary of State for the Middle East, in effect. And so what he wanted to do was to reduce the amount of British troops very heavily, because British had casualties in the uprising, the rebellion of 1920, and Britain was going broke, and Churchill realised that. So he thought, well, if you could get the RAF to do it, and you have a collaborative army, in terms of a new Iraqi army to do it with a stooge as the king, then you can just let the RAF do it with the stooge army, and then you can take the Indian army back to India to suppress the Indians, and you can take the British soldiers back home.
During the First World War, was the Ottoman Empire a great prize for Churchill?
Well, it was very important, and of course it was a strategic mess, because actually we should have backed the Hashemites. If we backed the Hashemites, then the House of Saud would never have got the holy places, and the history of recent years would have been very different. Because the Hashemites lost it, because of course there are 3 divisions. Of course, one of the Hashemites got Jordan, one got Iraq in compensation for not getting Syria, and then but the senior part of the Hashemite dynasty controlled the holy places. And originally, then you would have had a king going all the way from the holy places right up to Iraq and Syria, which is the original sort of idea that Hashemites had. And then, of course, by backing the Sauds, because the Hashemites weren't grateful enough and weren't lick-spittly enough, they had a mind of their own, we created an awful lot of the Middle East we now have.
But he was also determined to hang on to Egypt as well, which becomes quite important later on at the very end of his career.
Absolutely, and that Egypt is interesting because Egypt never fell particularly in the auspices of the colonial office. It remained in the Foreign Office. But Churchill had an interesting relationship with Egypt because he always wanted to keep it, informally at least, as a part of the British Empire, even into the 50s. And you can see this going on with Nasser and so forth. And ultimately, this leads to the Suez Crisis once Churchill leaves power. So his relationship with Egypt is a very complicated one that sort of goes throughout his life.
In August 1940, despite the fact that Britain faced a possible German invasion, Churchill ordered the bulk of the British army to concentrate on defending Egypt.
He wanted to fight the Germans somewhere. He actually wanted to fight them on land, well, to fight the Axis on land somewhere. And of course, you couldn't do that in Britain, but you could do that in North Africa. And of course, he also wanted to defend the old fields, because of course, if Egypt was indefensible, then of course the Germans could land, capture the Middle Eastern oil, and then everything. Then we wouldn't have any oil supplies. So it was a strategic decision. But also, he was a fighter, and he wanted to take the enemy to wherever he could, and he couldn't fight them on the beaches of Dover. But he could fight them in North Africa, and that's what he decided to do. And that, of course, played very well with the Americans, because we were actually fighting the Germans and Italians.
At the close of his career, was Churchill implicated in the 1956 attempt to invade Egypt and retake control of the Suez Canal?
Well, he was, and of course, the idea that Nasser was a new sort of version of Mussolini was complete cuckoo. I mean, he wasn't really anything of the kind. If we'd helped with building the Aswan Dam and all the rest, which we could have done, then things would have been very different. And there's no reason why Nasser should have been against us. But he was created into an enemy by us, in a sense. And of course, the deal with the French was completely loopy. And Churchill, as a pro-American, should have realised that. Because the Americans said they didn't want to have a war just before presidential election. And of course, I have lots of friends who are Hungarian, and they've never forgiven us, because we were messing around in Suez while they were needing us in Hungary, and we said, "Oh no, we can't do it."
That was the rebellion against
the rebellion against the Soviet Union in 1956, and so we totally betrayed the Hungarians. Not that we could have done anything really probably to help the Hungarians. We could have done a whole lot more to help them in other ways. Though. He was very much an imperialist from beginning to end, and of course that was part of Iraq, because of course Iraq was the air. He was being Secretary for Air after the First World War, and Iraq was part of the air route through to India. So you didn't actually have to go down the Suez Canal and all the way around anymore. You could actually fly, and of course, if you controlled Iraq, then you controlled the air, part of the route by air to India, which was, of course, the jewel in the crown for him.
During 1940, when he had many things on his plate, Britain was fighting for survival, he gave the go-ahead for what becomes the construction of the Regent's Park Mosque in central London. Why was that?
Well, it's interesting. So it would be wrong to say that this was Churchill's plan. It was actually a plan that had been worked on since, I think, 1911 among people, among others like the Aga Khan. But Churchill, it's brought to his attention by Lord Lloyd, who had been trying under Chamberlain's government to get approval for this since, I think, about 1936. And Lord Lloyd would repeatedly sort of write to Lord Halifax, and would also write to Chamberlain, and they said, look, we don't have time or the money. And this happens immediately in the war, and Lloyd again approaches Churchill, and he immediately approves it. And in many ways, I would say that Churchill approves it because he took very seriously the notion of trying to bring what I'm going to call the Islamic world into the war on the Allied side. And in doing so, it sort of illustrates how serious he was about it. And there were, of course, other mosques in Britain, one in Cardiff that actually some money from his wartime government also went to helping after it had been bombed.
Do you think, and just in conclusion regarding his attitude to Islam, I mean, he wrote about it in his histories. He wrote approving of Saladin, for instance, in terms of that. But do you think it was instrumental, or do you think there was a genuine affection?
Well, I think we have to split into two ways. The first, we have to say Churchill's thoughts on Islam as a religion, and the truth about that is Churchill very rarely reflected on Islam as a religion, because Churchill very rarely reflected on any sort of religion. I mean, he uses talk of religion in his rhetoric, of course, from time to time, but for the most part, Churchill was an atheist. And so he rarely reflected on the nature of Islam as a religion. But he was very interested in what I'm going to say Islamic culture, Eastern culture. And you can see this because, and it's true throughout his life, because he continued to go to Marrakesh in Morocco, even into the late 1950s, so that he could paint. He paints several pictures of sort of Moroccan market scenes and so forth. And he always had this sort of interest in that. And I mean, and this is totally, it was common among people, from a Victorian background, particularly from a conservative Victorian background. So I would say that he did have a genuine fascination for the culture of sort of Islamic culture and sort of culture of the Levant and the East and sort of Ottoman culture and so forth.
Did Churchill have a romantic 19th century view of the Islamic world?
Oh yes, absolutely. Yes, it was very much a 19th century romantic view, and it was the view of the young subaltern. He had been in the northwest frontier, and and of course the brave Arab, and all the rest, and of course the idea that sort of the Muslim soldiers were the better soldiers than the Hindu ones. He was very anti-Hindu. I mean, he was very unsympathetic to Gandhi, whereas he thought that the Muslims were the martial races, and all the rest. And that was one of the problems too, of course, when it came to Indian independence. I mean, he was very sympathetic more sympathetic to the Muslims than he was to the Hindus.
And how is Churchill viewed today in the Middle East?
I don't know if he's remembered or not. I mean, if you ask the average Iraqi, did you know that Churchill created your country? I mean, the answer is probably not. And we remember Sykes-Picot far more than we remember Churchill, but it was actually Churchill who created it rather than Sykes-Picot. If you look at the Sykes-Picot map, the whole of Mosul province of Iraq is in Syria. So the Sykes-Picot map, I say in my book, from the e-book, From the Ashes of War, is actually Churchill who created the Middle East, not Sykes-Picot at all.